Time of death was already written on his chart when his eyes opened. The armed men at the door went still. He didn't look at them. He looked at me, the nurse nobody ever noticed, and said my name. 3 hours earlier, that man had been a John Doe with no name. He came in on a crash cart, 3 bullets, no ID, and my attending called the time in the doorway. I worked the night shift nobody wanted, and I never let a stranger die unnamed. So when they told me to stop, I didn't move. One heartbeat I refused to give up, even at the cost of my license and my name. His chest rose once under my palms before the monitor agreed. If you've ever been the only one who wouldn't let go, you know what that fight costs. The man they left for dead knew my name before I ever gave it to him. And I still didn't know why. If you've ever been the one nobody noticed while everyone else let go, tell me where you're listening from tonight. The night it happened, St. Merrick's Memorial smelled like antiseptic and old rain. I was the nurse who took the gurney no one else wanted, the one who held the hand of the dying when the family was already gone. 27 and 2 years past residency, and the hospital had stopped saying my name out loud a long time ago. The call came in at 11:40. Gunshot victim, inbound, 3 rounds, no vitals. I was at the bay door when the gurney came through. No ID. No wallet. No phone. Just a torn suit and a shirt that had been expensive before the paramedics cut it away. And a single gold cufflink still glinting under the trauma light, the only part of him that looked like somebody. I didn't care who he was. I cared that his chest wasn't moving. Dr. Hale, my attending, looked at the monitor and called it. Time of death, 11:41. By the book, I should have stepped back and let the body go to the morgue with a tag that said unknown. I didn't step back. If watching one woman refuse to let go of a stranger when everyone told her to stop pulls you in, subscribe to Raven Vow, the night was only getting stranger. I put my hands on his chest and started compressions. The charge nurse said my name, sharp, like a warning. The room got very quiet behind me. I could feel them all waiting for me to do the protocol thing, the thing that would have let me go home clean and on time. I was not a sensible nurse. It was the one thing the hospital could never fix, no matter how many performance reviews I signed. I worked him for 41 minutes. My arms shook, the sweat ran into my eyes, and I remember thinking, mid-code, that I'd probably be written up for this, and I didn't care. I locked my elbows and let my whole body become the rhythm, press and release. The monitor never flatlined. It kept tracing the same thin wave, electricity without a heartbeat strong enough to move blood. The textbooks call it pulseless electrical activity, the one arrest you can walk back if you refuse to stop. So I refused to stop. The room had gone so still I could hear the clock, the hiss of the ventilator, my own breath. And then, at minute 41, between compressions, his chest rose. Not from me. From him. The first breath since the shooting, and I watched his ribs lift under my hands while the monitor relocked into a real rhythm, a heartbeat that belonged to him. I looked up. The room was full of people, and none of them were looking relieved. They were looking afraid. That was the moment I should have understood something. I didn't yet. I just knew I had pulled a man back from the edge, and nobody in that building wanted to celebrate it. The charge nurse went pale and walked out. Dr. Hale followed her, without a word about my protocol violation. I stayed beside him through the early hours because there was no one else to stay, which had always been the story of my life. No family to call, no next of kin, no name for the paperwork. I cleaned the wounds and closed the lines, and kept noticing things that didn't belong. Calluses that had no place on a businessman's hands. A chest built like a man whose work never made it to daylight. The single gold cufflink catching the light, like it was trying to tell me something I wasn't smart enough to hear. I didn't know yet that the quiet of that room was the most dangerous thing in it. At 4 in the morning, they came. Not through the waiting room, through the staff entrances, the service doors, the stairwells. Men in dark suits. They took positions at every exit like they were sealing a bank vault. The charge nurse came to me, and her voice was different from the one she used on the ward. Softer. Careful. Whatever you see from here, she said, you didn't see him. He was never here. I asked her who he was. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw the answer in her face before she said it. I don't know, she said. The fact that she wouldn't lie better told me more than the truth would have. The wing was under lockdown. Not a drill. Not a panic. A quiet, absolute lockdown for one body in one room, and I was the only one in the building who didn't understand why. I stayed because they wouldn't let me leave, and I watched them. The men outside his door didn't sit, didn't speak, didn't relax. One of them pressed his palm flat against the glass at the sight of the heart rhythm and moved his lips in what I was fairly sure was a prayer. For a John Doe. For a nobody. Nobody gets prayed for like that. I reread his chart that night and kept going back to the gap in it. No name. No age in the system. But a man doesn't get a full floor lockdown and praying guards and an attending who walks out white as paper unless he is somebody. At 4:40, he opened his eyes. I was standing at the foot of the bed, adjusting the drip, and the monitors went from a steady rhythm to something faster. I looked up. His eyes were open. Dark, and for a second completely blank, like a man coming up from very deep water. The armed men at the door went still, an entire corridor of killers and bodyguards, frozen by one open pair of eyes. He didn't look at them. He looked at me. And he said, Iris. The word stopped the whole wing. It was my name, spoken like he had known it for years, like he had been waiting to say it. I had never told it to him. I was the nurse nobody noticed, and this dying John Doe who had been pulseless for 41 minutes looked at me and spoke my name. The man closest to the door made a sound. Then he dropped to one knee. Don Vito, he said. You need to stay still. I remember the way the room tilted. Don, the word didn't fit in my mouth. I had heard the city-feared name whispered in the break room for years. That man was not supposed to be in my trauma bay. I stood in the fluorescent light with my name still hanging in the air, and understood, all at once, that I had done something enormous. I had brought the Don of the Vane family back from the dead. His detail chief came forward, a wall of a man with a face like a closed door, looked at me, then at the patient, and something passed between them I couldn't read. Phones raised, orders flowing. I was still at the foot of the bed with my gloves on, understanding nothing. He watched me the whole time, the way you watch something you're not sure you can keep. Before I left my shift that morning, I reviewed my own chart work the way I always did, because I was the kind of nurse who checked her own work twice. And I went cold. Do not resuscitate. Dated tonight, timed 11:20, 20 minutes before the ambulance ever reached the bay. In handwriting I did not recognize. I had written every line of that chart myself. There was no DNR order. Nobody had put one on his file when he came in. I had been the only one at his bedside for 41 minutes, and the only order I had written was the one that fought for his life. I called the charge nurse over. She looked at the line, her face doing something complicated, and then she said, "That's always been there. The way you say a thing you've been told to say." I looked at the other nurses. Every one of them looked away. They were all lying, and they all knew it, and I couldn't understand why. I went looking for the doctor whose signature was on the line. He had signed it at 11:20, before the patient was even in the system, and clocked out before the man stabilized. No notes, no callback. Just a signature on a line that said "Do not resuscitate," in a building full of armed men praying for this exact man to live. I stood in the empty hallway and felt, for the first time that night, genuinely afraid. Not of the guns. Not of the lockdown. Of the math. Somebody wanted the Dawn to die quietly, and they'd built the perfect paper trail, one that failed only because it was dated before he was even in the building, and I'd refused to let the paper decide. Somebody had written that order before the ambulance ever rolled. Somebody had been waiting for him to die. I went back to his room to check the drip, the only one in that building who'd look at his chart twice. And I found the second thing. A tiny gold clamp, clipped onto the medication line, forcing the drip shut. I knew what it was the moment I saw it. The line carried the drugs, keeping his freshly restarted heart beating. A clamp like that would starve his circulation in silence. No alarm, no mistake, just a slow collapse the code team would read as a complication. I reached for it, and my hand stopped. The clamp carried a crest. The same gold crest as the cufflink on his torn jacket, a small, intricate mark, like two pieces of the same puzzle finally laid side by side. The man everyone was guarding was being killed by the people guarding him. I heard footsteps in the supply corridor behind me. The doors of the wing sealed, one by one, with a soft mechanical hiss. I picked up the clamp, closed my hand around it, and slid it into my pocket before whoever it belonged to could take it back. I had evidence in my hands. I came back to his room and told him about the DNR, because I couldn't hold it in anymore. I expected orders. A wall of men and a flurry of violence. What I got was him reaching out, taking the pen I'd dropped, and handing it back, keeping his hands visible, like I was the one who needed to be calm. It was the first time I had been alone with him since the lockdown, and I understood why the whole city feared him. He had a stillness that was absolute. A man who didn't need to move fast because everyone around him moved for him. And when I reached for the pen, his fingers brushed mine, deliberate, measured, like everything he did, and stayed there a beat longer than they needed to. "You checked your own work twice," he said. "That's why you found it." "It's a DNR that shouldn't exist," I said. "Whoever wrote it wants you dead." He nodded, like I'd confirmed something he already knew. And then he said, "St. Merrick's isn't a charity hospital, Iris. It's mine." I thought I misheard him. He explained quietly, in the same even voice. The hospital had been built by his family decades ago, after his mother died waiting for a trauma surgeon who never came. Fronted as city charity so no rival family would ever look at it twice. The Vane family's wounded had always been treated here, first and fastest, under cover of the poorest patients in the city. I had worked in this building for 6 years, scrubbed floors and held hands and prayed over strangers, never knowing I was inside the private hospital of the most feared family in the city. "Why me?" I asked. "Why did you know my name?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been reading your Commendation file for years. The nurse who wouldn't let a stranger die unnamed." He looked at me, and something in his face softened into something I couldn't name. "But I didn't read about you in a file, Iris. I watched you. Every patient who came in with no family, I checked who stayed. It was always you. I knew you were the one who would stay." I stood there with my hands shaking, holding the evidence of a murder plot in my pocket, and understood that the man everyone feared had been reading my name for years without ever meeting me. He said, "The person who gave them my route is still in this building. And they're going to try again." The words sat between us. I looked at the door where his men were stationed, and I understood. The traitor wasn't outside. The traitor was inside. Someone with access, someone who knew the hospital, someone who could write a DNR and clip a gold clamp onto a drip line. And the only person in the room who was not one of his men was me. The detail chief came in before dawn with a tablet, and he didn't look at me when he spoke. The Lombardis. The rout. The city believing the Dawn was dead. I stood by the window, pretended to adjust the blinds, and heard enough to understand the shape of it. The Lombardis had bought his route and were moving on Vane territory at first light. The captains wouldn't believe their Dawn had survived until they saw him standing, and the Empire was bleeding out its faith while a murder plot sat clipped to his drip. He made the decision without any heat in his voice. He would not evacuate. He would not call off the war. He would be wheeled to the wing's tall window before dawn, upright and alive, where the family that had tried to bury him could see him breathing. On his own terms. It was the same quiet cadence he had used all night, and I realized I had been hearing that cadence for 6 years. The founder's calm. The hospital's rules, the way the whole building bent to a certain order, it was him. I had been serving his hand all night without knowing it was a hand at all. The wing's outer door opened, and a woman walked in. She moved through the armed men like she owned them. Pale coat, dark hair, a face that had been beautiful once and was now just expensive. She didn't ask to be let in. The guard stepped aside for her, and I saw the way his face changed the second she appeared. Her name was Seraphine. Seraphine Lombardi. And she was the woman who had almost been his wife. She stayed beside him for 20 minutes, and I watched from the doorway like the outsider I was. They spoke a language I didn't know, names and places, shorthand for a life I had never been part of. For the first time since I'd saved his life, I felt like I was on the outside of something I had almost stepped into. Before she left, she touched my arm. "Thank you," she said, "for what you did." Her smile was warm, and I told myself the cold I felt was jealousy, the insecurity of a nurse watching the woman who almost owned his whole life. Not danger. Just envy. I watched her walk back down the corridor, past the supply room, and I saw her hand touch the same door handle I had touched hours earlier, when I'd found the clamp. She walked out into the dark without looking back. I checked the drip line anyway. The new clamp was on the replacement tubing. It was tighter this time. I went to him and laid the clamp on the tray beside his bed. I told him what I'd seen, the handle, the hand, the tighter clamp, and I watched him read the meaning in it faster than I could speak it. The woman who had almost been his wife had been in the supply room, and I was the only one who had seen her touch the door. "You have proof," he said. "Do you have anywhere safe to put it?" "I have a pocket," I said. "And nobody to give it to." The look he gave me then, I would come back to it for years. It was not fear. It was not gratitude. It was something older and more careful, like a man who had spent his whole life reading the room, finally reading one person and finding the answer he had been looking for. At 5:40, an hour before dawn, his vitals collapsed. The monitor screamed. The code team flooded the room, and I saw them hesitate at the foot of the bed, the DNR line, the order that said let him go. They were going to let the man they'd been ordered to let die, and nobody would ever know the difference. I threw the chart aside. I put my hands on his chest, and I worked him again. 41 minutes the first time. I didn't count this time. I remember the clamp in my hand while I pressed, thinking if they want him dead they will have to go through me, and I was not going to move. I broke the seal on the tampered bag and restarted his rhythm a whisper before the room gave up the second time. When his eyes opened again, he was already looking for me. The room went still. And I heard myself say it, before I could stop it, the words coming out like a verdict. He's alive because of a DNR that never existed and a drip that was clamped. And I have the proof. I held up the gold clamp. I held up the chart with the false order. I laid them on the tray where his men could see them, and I watched the room understand. The man they were guarding was being killed by the people guarding them. The assassination wasn't a bullet. It was paperwork and a piece of gold, and the only reason it had failed was that a nobody nurse read her own chart twice. Vittorio looked at his inner circle. His voice was quiet, and the whole wing listened to it. "Which one of you," he said, "gave my name to the Lombardis?" Before the sun came up, the truth came apart in his hands. The clamp's crest was a family mark used by exactly 4 people, and one of them had sold his route. The doctor who signed the DNR had been on the Lombardi payroll for 2 years. The route had been bought through Seraphine's access, her name, her passwords, her hand on the same door handle I had touched. He didn't arrest her loudly. He had her brought to him at dawn, and I watched him hand her the clamp, the small gold piece that had tried to kill him, and watched her face go blank. He told her, quietly, that she would leave the city tonight under Vane escort. Her family's move was over. Her name would be traded for a regency she would never hold. He didn't raise his voice. The Lombardi dawn move collapsed the moment the city saw the dawn alive before sunrise, wheeled to the tall window by his own men, alive in the first gray light. The captains who wouldn't believe came and saw him breathing, and the war died before it started. When they let her out, I was standing in the corridor. She paused beside me, and I thought she would say something vicious. Instead she looked at me with something almost like pity. "This family eats people like you," she said quietly. "He will chew you up and never once know he's done it." I thought about it all the way through sunrise. I stood at the window with my name badge still pinned to my scrub top, watching the dark go gray as the wing emptied behind me. He came to me alone, when the ward was empty for the first time since midnight. "Iris," he said. It was the second time he had said my name. The first time it had been a shock, a key turning in a lock. This time it was a claim. He stood in the dawn light, sleeves rolled, tube marks still on his arms, looking at me like I was the only thing in the room he couldn't explain. "You refused to stop when my own doctors called the time," he said. "My men will tell you I don't owe anyone anything. They're wrong. I owe you my name, my life, and whatever you'll let me give you from here." I told him I didn't save him for payment. "I know," he said. "That's exactly why it's yours." He walked me out of the wing that morning, past the guards and the detail chief, and I understood he was doing it on purpose. Showing me to them. Making sure they all saw the nurse nobody noticed being walked out by the dawn of the Vane family. He took me to the administrative hall and showed me the founder's portrait, a young man, unrecognizable, with the same eyes, and told me I had worked in his house for 6 years without knowing I was safe in it. The crest cufflink was unpinned from his sleeve. He held it out to me on his palm, the same gold mark that had been the first thing I'd noticed in the trauma light, and he said, "This belongs to the family. It's yours now." I looked at the cufflink. I looked at the man the whole city feared, standing in his own hospital, offering me the only piece of him he had ever carried. He did not ask me to accept it. He held it out and let me decide, the way he had let me decide whether to step back from his chest in the trauma bay. And I understood that the fight that cost me 41 minutes of my arms had given me the one thing I'd spent my whole life not knowing I wanted. I took it, and set it down beside my badge. Someone who saw me. The name badge I had worn for 6 years, the one the hospital had never once thanked, sat in the warm dawn light next to his crest cufflink. 2 things that had never belonged in the same room, resting together at last. I looked at them for a long moment, and I thought about the woman who had told me this family would chew me up. She was right that I didn't belong to this world. She was wrong that it would destroy me. The man everyone feared looked at me across that table, and the fear I had carried my whole life, the fear that I would spend forever being the one who gives and never the one who is seen, folded itself up and stopped existing. The whole city was afraid of him. He was the only place in it I had ever felt safe. Some nights, the one who saves the most feared man in the city is the one who needed saving all along. Would you have trusted him, the man everyone warned you to fear, after you'd watched the people closest to him try to kill him twice? Tell me in the comments. And if stories like this make your heart race, subscribe to Raven Vow.